Gardeners, I will teach you to crush squash bugs with your mind. So I got a lot of questions about what I would do about squash bugs and squash vine borer, two major pests of squash and pumpkins that cause gardeners a lot of grief. So in this video, I'm going to be applying this systems thinking to how we can deal with squash bugs. Now, I have a whole other video about this here. But the basic idea is that when we're dealing with complex systems like gardens, we often do things wrong because complex systems don't act the way we think they should. So we'll usually use the obvious brute force methods where we just see the squash bugs or vine borers and try to directly control their numbers by killing them. But then that labor becomes a permanent part of our gardening, and counterintuitively, we often end up killing the things that would eat the squash bugs and vine borers in the first place and make the problem worse in the long run. So instead, we want to move up to these higher leverage points of changing our behaviors, changing the systems we're using, and changing the way that we're thinking about the whole thing. So the key here is that the brute force methods take force, which is labor. So the more we can switch up to these higher leverage points, the less labor we have to do. So when we really get it dialed in right, and we're really focusing on these behaviors and systems and paradigm shifts, we may find that we are not doing pest maintenance work at all anymore, and yet the pests are really no longer a problem because we have taken care of the pest issues with our minds. Like JEDI. You've already seen the shorter version of this video. In this one, I'm going to go into a lot more geeky detail, so let's check it out. So let's start by thinking about the behaviors that are causing the problem in the first place. In the conventional garden, we start by creating the perfect habitat for squash bugs and vine borers. Then we pick varieties that are especially susceptible to them, and then we kill all of the natural allies that would help control them. Squash bugs shall always triumph because good is dumb. So behavior change 1, stop killing your friends. There are actually a lot of things that will eat squash bugs and their eggs, in particular tachinid flies and ground beetles, but we often kill them in the conventional garden. In particular, tilling, growing in monocultures, and using poisons will kill our friends. Next, we can stop planting varieties that are particularly prone to this insect damage. This part gets geeky. The fancy term for this is comparative advantage, which means grow it's easy. For example, there are two main types of pepo squash. One evolved right up in here, which you see is an overlap to the area with squash vine borer and squash bugs. They have evolved great defenses for those pests. The others, like zucchinis, evolved down here, an arid region, and they have no evolved adaptations for the pest. Machata species, like butternut, spent a long time evolving down here, so they have great adaptations for these pests as well. These Maxima varieties are delicious, but difficult to grow, because they evolved in this arid region without these pests and have no evolved defenses at all. Okay. Now, there's a reason why I go into what seems like an unnecessary amount of detail for a short 3-minute video here about this. And this is really important, and the main reason why is to show that I know stuff. But beyond that, I'd like to communicate the underlying principle here about what it means to work with nature instead of working against nature, and how in a lot of cases that means working with what evolved in our regions, or at least in regions that are similar to this. So you'll notice in those maps the range of the pests that we're talking about coincides with what we call the 30 inches of precipitation line a little bit west of the Mississippi. So this whole moist woodland region to the east of the United States is a great habitat for these pests. You get into the arid regions and not so much. And in South America, two of these pests are also there, right? And so the squash species that evolved in the humid areas where these pests are prevalent also have these natural evolved defenses to those pests, whereas the ones that evolved in the dry regions do not. So now here's the important thing about that, is that when it comes to choosing our species, if you are in a dry region, the Pepo and the Maxima species that evolved in dry climates and arid climates are going to be great to go to, right? And then for those of us who live in this like hell realm of of these squash pests in these humid regions, we might let the people who live in the arid regions grow the maximas for us for the most part, right? And we can focus on the ones that grow easily. So, this gives me an overall great strategy, and this is the strategy I use in my gardens. I mostly grow the easy ones, right? So I mostly will plant out a bunch of this gives you my overall strategy. One, I love to have some summer squash. So I pick like one variety of summer squash so that I can save my seed. Because if I grow two varieties and they're the same species, they're going to cross-pollinate and I won't have viable seeds. Or they'll be mixed seeds. They'll probably rogue. With Pepos, that can be dangerous. I won't get into that. But that can promote this bitterness gene to come back in, and it can actually make those squash poisonous. So instead, I will grow like one species of Pepo and then one species of mochatas. And usually for me, that's Seminole pumpkin or Tonda Padana, because those are just two of my real favorites. Cheese pumpkins, Long Island cheese pumpkins, neck pumpkins are absolutely great. And Dickinson field pumpkins and the old varieties of butternuts, all of those were really directly evolved from the Seminole pumpkin that grew wild in this region with lots of squash vine borers and squash bugs. So they all have really great evolved defenses to that. Now, when you get into the modern hybrids and modern things that have been grown for 100 years of selection with pesticides, they have lost their evolved resistances to these pests because they have been grown for a long period of time, many generations now, without those pests. So that's the other tip here, is that if you want to grow these things without the pests, you need to grow old heirloom varieties. And the reason why I'm going through all this is that these same kind of strategies apply to all sorts of crops, right? Not just squash. So if I make those my main species, then I can grow those with very little labor. Now I have a little time to grow something like a Blue Hubbard, one of those Maximas. Now, those require a really long season. They, don't perform well with the pests and diseases of our moist region. So I know I'm going to have to hand pick off those eggs, the squash borer eggs. And if they get squash vine borer on there, I meant the squash bug eggs. And if they get squash vine borer in them, I'm going to have to go and get some BTK and inject which is an organic pesticide, and inject the stem with that to kill those in order to get those plants through. But since I'm not doing that on all my squash plants, I've got more time where I can do that on the ones that are going to need it. So this is gets us back to the idea that once we have these higher leverage points in place, a little bit of aimed brute force can make all the difference in the world. And we can switch our systems up. For example, deep mulch and polycultures will attract both tachinid flies and ground beetles. So to me, once we start to get into these systems thinking and systems, we're really hitting powerful leverage points because the systems ultimately kind of control our behaviors too. For example, I can tell you, change your behavior of tilling. Tilling causes the conditions that make the pests thrive. It kills all of their natural allies and so on. But that's easier said than done unless you know no-till growing systems. So here, learn just switching your system from a tillage system to a no-till system can have a huge impact. Then looking at those other things I just mentioned briefly, there are a few different things that we can do that become really big systems for systems changes for controlling these. Another one is polyculture, because which means growing lots of plants in together. Breaking these down, looking at the two main predators of squash bugs, just as one example. Ground beetles, for example, some things you can do that are research-based that promote more ground beetles in the garden are like using deep mulch, having nurse logs. If you watch my channel, you know how much I love nurse logs. So having lots of nurse logs around can make a big difference. Deep mulches, nurse logs, having constant ground covers, having dense plantings. So I love these kinds of growing systems where things are perfectly right spaced, not all crammed in too close, but also not big spaces in between them, using bed plantings instead of row plantings. So again, polyculture, understanding switching from a monoculture system to a polyculture system will fix all of that. Switching to a mulch system will help attract ground beetles. When it comes to taconid fly, one of the things that really attracts taconid flies is having an environment with lots of species all season long, multiple species of flowers going on, because they don't harm plants. They primarily feed on pollen and nectars, and they love to have all of lots of different flowering plants around. And if you want them next to the squash, where the squash bugs are at, and the squash vine borer, which they can also affect, then you have to have those flowers integrated in. So again, polyculture is a big thing there for attracting the taconid fly. And so if you look at the way I primarily grow squash, I've got videos on my no-till Three Sisters garden. And it's not just a Three Sisters garden, because as period reports showed, Native Americans grew a lot of different plants, flowering plants in the no-till, in their no-till Three Sisters system. So if you look at my systems, my slash mulch system for my Three Sisters, and the pictures that I have in there, you'll see there's monardas in there, there's native mints in there, there are non-natives like carrots in there, all sorts of different things all season long. And so that's going to really attract the taconid fly too. So again, that's switching to a whole different system for growing the squash. What I can tell you is that in a region where squash bugs and squash vine borers are major problems, after really even by the end of the first season where I was doing these kinds of techniques, I had huge beneficial populations built up, and I never lose plants or even really see significant damage from squash vine borer or squash bugs. They're there. I hear that squash vine borer. It sounds like a B-52 when it's flying around the garden. It's got, it's a really funny sound. It's a really loud bug. But they just don't do enough damage where I ever notice them. They don't kill my plants, and they don't harm the productivity, because I've controlled them with my mind by using these systems. So using these strategies, I'm able to grow lots of squash with almost no pest management labor. And finally, this brings us to the highest leverage point of all, which is changing the whole paradigm. See, long ago, I switched my paradigm from thinking that I wanted to exploit the land to grow a lot of squash. And instead, I've become someone who uses my gardening to basically pay myself to manage the land and make a healthy, vibrant ecosystem filled with lots of habitat and beneficial insects and native species. So because of that, I am constantly investing in creating this rich, abundant ecosystem. And then that ecosystem, that beautiful, abundant ecosystem, and then that system there goes back and helps me grow food. The ecologists call this the diversity resiliency principle, where they say the greater number of species there are in the system, the greater resilience to pests and disease it confers on the species in the system. So by this whole different paradigm of thinking about focusing on regenerating the land and creating a healthy ecosystem, instead of just like, what can I get out of the garden? Instead, it's Bill Mollison used to say, never ask, what can I get from somebody or something? Instead, ask, what can we co-create together if we cooperate? And that includes the ecosystem. So my whole paradigm is about collaborating and cooperating with the ecosystem and mutually creating something together. Another paradigm shift is away from the idea of conventional pest management, which I do with hand labor, or even organic pest management or spraying, right? And even transcending the idea of integrated pest management, which starts with some of these ideas in a weaker way, and then falls back on the pesticides. So instead, I'm using what we call holistic natural management. And this is all about that first paradigm I said. Everything we do in holistic natural management is holistic, meaning it benefits the whole ecosystem. So by having healthy soil that's really rich in soil biodiversity, that's going to help my plants grow better. It's going to help moisture stay in the soil better, but it's also going to be the same things that I do that by having deep mulch and nurse logs and polyculture, the things that help attract taconid fly and the ground beetles. So that's going to be my pest management. And I just mentioned, trying to increase biodiversity, because that's great. And as I do that, it turns out that also increases soil fertility. So that's my pest management and soil fertility. The nurse logs that I mentioned also help with watering. So another one of our holistic natural management things would be no-till. Of course, when we till, we're destroying beneficial insect habitat as well. So this is a huge fundamental paradigm shift, switching up to holistic natural management. Now, if this is the sort of thing that interests you, I have two great books on the topic I'd like you to check out. One is called The Beginner's Guide, The Beginner's Landscape Transformation Manual. You can find it at www.transformativeadventures.org. And if you want a huge gardening book filled with stuff like this, then the book Beauty and Abundance is one of the biggest gardening books that is research-based but cutting edge, filled with permaculture strategies. So check those out if you're into this, and good luck gardening like a Jedi.